Hello, I've been in a bit of a reading slump lately, which might come as somewhat of a surprise because I've been doing book talks lately. I have not been reading to the capacity that I feel like I should be for the time that I have. And I mean, if we're being completely honest, part of that comes down to I have accrued many hobbies, but I want to read more. And I have this issue where I'll start a book and I'll be interested in the book, but then I'll put it down and just kind of forget it exists. Right now I am in the middle of 3 separate books. One of them is Red Queen, which has been like super popular in the YA market for a while. I was listening to the audiobook and there's just a point that I got really confused about what was going on. I think mostly just because I zoned out. So I have the physical copy and I was gonna read it, but I haven't gotten back into it. I'm also in the middle of reading Haunted by Chuck Palahniuk because it's Chuck Palahniuk. I do think anything by Palahniuk, you have to be in the right mood for it, and if you're not, it's not going to be a good time. And then I was also reading, I think it's Lord of Shadows from Cassandra Clare. And that one I was just having issues because it's the first book in that particular trilogy, and she does make it really accessible for somebody that discovers her through that particular trilogy. But it comes with a lot of exposition that is very redundant. If you've read the other books in the Shadowhunter Chronicles. Editing Kendra here, also known as Kendra from the future. Somehow, someway, I lost footage, which is unfortunate because it was the very footage that explained, you know, what this video is. So here I am from the future. The point of this video is not to talk about the books that I haven't finished, although I've spent plenty of time doing that so far in this video. The point was more to challenge myself to read more books. In particular, as you may have gleaned from the title of this video, I challenged myself to read 5 books in 5 days. At this point, the challenge is several weeks over, but I'll tell you what 5 books I went with. First of all, Misery by Stephen King. You will hear my reviews of all of these in the video, I should say. I knew nothing about this book going into it, aside from it was a writer that was abducted by a psycho crazy lady, and the whole novel revolved around them two being in this house together. Tender is the Flesh, which is a translated work. The author is based in Argentina. This was one that I knew nothing about, but I knew that it had a lot of good reviews, and I knew that it had to do with cannibalism, so it was very horrifying in genre. Stepping a little bit away from horror into a kind of sort of a thriller, but it's really truly a memoir, In the Dream House. Another one I didn't really know much about other than it does kind of play on the tropes of different genres. So there's like a dash of horror, a dash of fairy tale, a dash of choose your own adventure, all in here. So it was really an interesting pickup choice. Back into thriller with Dark Matter, very philosophical, very thriller-esque. Went into very, very blindly. It was between this and one other book. I don't remember what it was, and I held them up to my husband and he said this one. So this is the one we went with. And then finally this one, which I had my eyes on for a long while, but I'm gonna leave it at that. I really hadn't read a whole lot of horror or thriller for quite a while, and so I wanted to reacquaint myself with the genre, especially since I'm going to be taking a writing class that focuses on writing horror, and I need to have kind of an understanding of how these sorts of stories are presented, but also I need to figure out my own tastes. As you hear my reviews of all 5 books, you'll hear me kind of approach this from a creative writer's perspective and sort of talking about like how the author presents the story, because that's ultimately what my goal is in reading these. So now that I have horrified you with this lengthy introduction, let's jump into the actual video now. We're gonna start with Misery. Good morning, it is 9:20 on Monday. I have read about 70 to 73 pages into Misery so far. I did most of my reading last night. It was after midnight, so it counts as today. Eli and I are about to take our dogs out for a quick little trip, and then once we come back, I'll be getting back into it. So check in with you later in the day. So it's about at 7:20 right now, still Monday, and I am on about page 200, so we have found newspaper clippings. I'll say at this point in the book, it's going okay. I wasn't super sold on the beginning, but it's getting better. I just wanted to check in as far as where I'm at so far. I think I'm on track to finish by the end of today. I obviously had several hours that I was not able to sit and read, so I've got about 150 pages to go though, so I'm gonna get back to reading. Okay, so it is just shy of 10:15 and I am on page 300 of 350. We're almost there. I'll say it picks up a lot better in the later half of the book. And I'll talk about this more, I think, once I get through the whole thing and can kind of collect my whole thoughts on it. But there are definitely a lot of issues that I had in the beginning that are not quite as prevalent towards the end. So I'm enjoying it a lot more and able to kind of slip into the story a little bit more, as weird as that sounds, because it's kind of like it's not fun. At the rate that this is going, probably gonna be around midnight by the time I have this finished, but it's fine. I have a totally normal, healthy snack. I have my puppy, I have my water. It's all good. So I will check back in with you in about 50 pages. 11:23. I finished at 11:20. I'm collecting my thoughts slowly. So as I said before, I wasn't a huge fan of the first part. I think a lot of it comes down to, especially at the very beginning, there was a lot of telling. So chapter 4 ends with, the third was that Annie Wilkes was dangerously crazy. Mind you, by this point in the story, she really hasn't done anything out of the ordinary. Like, she's literally just taking care of him. So why are we being told that she's crazy? In chapter 5, we get kind of some moments where she seems to be disassociating, but nothing else really raising red flags about her. And so again, at the very end of the chapter, so chapter 5, we get, for the first time, clearly the thought surfaced in Paul Sheldon's mind. I am in trouble here. This woman is not right. But again, aside from a minor bit of dissociation, which is entirely coming from Paul's perspective, I don't see it. Now, obviously, as the story progresses, we see it so much more, and even chapter 6 starts to kind of get into this, especially, she says towards the end of chapter 6, "You owe me your life, Paul. I hope you'll remember that. I hope you'll keep that in mind." Then she left. So it's really not until that point that I start to believe that, okay, there's something wrong with Annie. And I feel like there are many instances in which it does a lot of telling when it really should be showing. And I think this is like a great example of that distinction between showing and telling, because sometimes telling can be done really well and it is needed. But in this case, it's one of those instances where it takes away so much. And I think that's one of the things that I struggle with when I try to read King. I understand the need for this to kind of spark up gradually. Yes, you could write a horror story where the villain, Annie, is psycho crazy right from the get-go. And she could be doing all of her psycho crazy things right from the get-go, but there is this added eeriness in her downward spiral, because we do see her mental state get significantly worse from the beginning to the end of this book. And it is very much paralleled by Paul's own mental state deteriorating, because at the beginning he seems like a more or less sane man just trying to get out of this kidnapping situation, and by the end, I'll give Stephen King this, he did a really good job at creating that PTSD feeling, where as the reader I was believing Paul's delusions as he was experiencing them, having those hallucinations, experiencing that paranoia of she is still out there in the world even though she's not. The first 50 pages were kind of a drag, honestly. It kind of picked up after that, but really it wasn't until I hit part 2, which is around 108 pages in, that things like that, at that point I was actually interested and I was actually hooked. The point at which she cuts off his leg was so vivid, and like I actually had kind of a reaction to it. And so it was really disappointing when we jumped over to his thumb, which I believe was the beginning of part 3. Part of it is just like losing a thumb feels less dramatic than losing a whole foot, but also the generalized description, it just didn't feel quite as terrifying of an experience as the foot did. And like I can kind of understand the purpose behind it to a degree, but it also felt like we're just repeating something that already happened. So speaking of repetition, this book has a lot of sort of chorus lines. Now a chorus line can be really great kind of grounding technique, a really great thing that kind of brings a reader back to a particular mental state or a particular thought. One of my favorite examples of a chorus line is Fight Club, where the narrator says, "I am John's fill in the blank," which they kept in the movie and they did a great job with it. I feel like this book had too many of those. So towards the beginning we have the pilings, which was based on one of Paul's memories of going to the beach and seeing this piling in the tide, but then we just sort of lose it for a long time and then it just sort of randomly pops back up towards the end. We get this weird parenthetical paragraph break where it just says "so vivid," usually when referring to Paul's imagination. We have this repetition of "rinse," "now rinse," and there were a few others that I didn't write down and my brain is not fully here yet because this is not a full book talk, but I just felt like there were too many of them and it was getting really confusing and I started forgetting which ones were coming from where. I want to sit with this one for a while, just kind of collect my thoughts on it, because this was a speed run of a read. Right now I'm feeling like this is like a 3 out of 5 stars, so it's not like terrible. 3 out of 5 is still decent depending on whose rating system you're on. I want to get through some more books before I finalize my rating on that one, because it could just be that I'm having a genre struggle. A tentative 3 out of 5. I also haven't watched the movie yet, so if you want me to watch the movie and then do a book talk talking about this and the movie, you know, together, let me know and smash that like button. Okay. I am going to go get some rest and then I will meet you back here tomorrow on Tuesday for Tenders the Flesh. See you in the morning. I finished in about 4 hours, so pretty decent time. There is a lot going on in here. It definitely has a lot to say about human greed and like self-preservation versus empathy. I definitely feel like this is a book that's gonna need its own book talk just because there's so much going on and there's a lot to unpack. So I've taken to writing miniature reviews on the title page in the books that I read, and literally all I wrote was, "Jesus, that was intense," 4.5 out of 5 stars. I mean, I went through a roller coaster of emotions reading this, which I did not at all expect to have happen. There was a point at which I felt like there was a little bit of romance happening. There are some elements of the plot that were very predictable, definitely very dark. Definitely would not recommend this to an average reader. It definitely gets a little gruesome in parts. People can no longer eat animals because animals have a virus that is deadly to humans, and so humans have turned to cannibalism, legalized cannibalism. So there's a whole industry around human meat, and it is just as awful as you probably would imagine, because it's not like the humans are being treated humanely. The humans are treated as cattle. So, and there is this whole scene where it does walk you through the slaughterhouse, and it's a little sickening. I will say I think it was well done. It wasn't like splatterpunk where it's graphic for the sake of being excessively graphic. It's not. It doesn't feel like this was pulled together for the shock value of it. Like the emotions that happen throughout feel very genuine, and the story plays really nicely on the kind of disconnect between the reader and the primary character, the protagonist. This was a case of me appreciating the third person. It was a super close third person, kind of like we see in Misery. I would say that this was even closer of a third person than Misery. So it really felt like first person, but I think the use of third person helped to kind of keep myself as the reader from getting too in his head, which allowed me to have almost deeper reactions than the main character had, because the main character has already lived through some amount of time of this new world. I will say the ending, it came really fast and hard, but it felt believable, but also it made me a little disgusted. It was definitely shocking. The actions of the main character in the end felt a little off from sort of the emotions that I had experienced throughout the novel, but there's also, again, that separation between the protagonist and the reader. And because we aren't completely fully in his head as we would be in a first person, there's a lot that we kind of miss, and there are some clues that indicate why he acted the way that he did at the ending. It's not like the ending was out of character, but it was still just sort of shocking because it's not at all what I was anticipating. So yeah, I have this at 4.5 out of 5 stars. If I can't go half stars, I would round up to 5 out of 5 stars. It was really good. There was just one emotional trick in particular that was played in here that felt a little cheap to me, and I just automatically cannot deal with that kind of emotional trick. And so that's why it lost like half a star, but otherwise really good. For those with strong stomachs, absolutely recommend. For those who don't have strong stomachs, do not recommend. So that is book number 2. I still need to edit my video for tomorrow, so I'm going to go do that, and then I will meet you tomorrow for In the Dream House. See you then. Good morning, I'm still waking up. It is 9 o'clock, but today we're gonna be so late in the morning. I'm still waking up, that's great. Today we're gonna be reading In the Dream House. So this is a memoir. Yeah, we're just gonna do some reading. Okay, so it is 1:40-ish, and I'm about 56 pages in. So I've gotten a little distracted, but can I just say, so far, it's kind of strange. Mostly just because of the audience. So at this point in the memoir, she is living in Iowa City, and it's so weird because she's mentioning these places, and I know exactly where she's talking about. Like, the only place that she's mentioned that I haven't been able to vividly picture is the house that she's living in, because she doesn't give the address. Also, if you were wondering about the list, I put my retainer back in. That's definitely been a really strange thing, because normally books take place in locations that I've never been to, or completely fictionalized locations. So to be able to visualize this so vividly is wild. The author herself was a writer prior to the memoir, and it definitely shows in the prose. I'm a poet and I know it. Just the descriptions are so good, and she understands the tropes that she's kind of playing off of, which is doubly interesting because this is a memoir, so this is a true story. There was a particular part in which her partner started yelling at her and told her, "You better not write about this." And she made this joke about how fear makes liars of us all, and that was just beautiful. It was just like a beautifully comedic but also slightly tragic line that just Also, I'm really intrigued by the perspective. So again, this is somebody who is going to school to be a writer, so she knows what she's doing. But the perspective shifts, and it shifts so beautifully and so seamlessly. So there were parts where we jump way back in her life, and that is where she uses that first person I. But then she does something really interesting throughout the relationship with the toxic individual. She switches the I to you. So it's second person intended as a first person. And she switches back and forth so seamlessly that there have been a couple times that I've stopped and had to like pay attention, like, what perspective are we in right now? And I could probably go on and on about what perspective does for the tone of a story, but the long and short of it, the use of second person in this case suggests that separation of self. Because for whatever it's worth, she's not necessarily claiming that narrative as her own. It's not super clear why just yet, whether that's for tragic reasons or for, you know, happy, healthy reasons. That's not super clear yet. And it might never be clear. That's entirely up to the author, but it's just really interesting. So I'm gonna keep reading and I'll check back with you in a few hours. Okay. Number 3 in the books. There was a lot of discussion about domestic abuse, particularly in terms of psychological abuse and how little it's talked about, especially given certain demographics. I will say it doesn't read quite like a typical memoir, and I don't feel like it would be as good as it is if it was. This is a story that does kind of go off on little tangents, and it's broken up in really short chapters, so you get kind of a tangent that goes this way and then comes back and then this way and comes back. So in that way, I don't think this book is for everyone if you're looking for a just kind of more or less linear story. So like if you watched my book talk on I'm Glad My Mom Died, that is a very linear story. It had some minor tangents, but it more or less went from beginning to end. This one really does not. It kind of skirts around the topic in a lot of ways. We don't get an in-depth look at the relationship, but a lot of the tangents do help to kind of make sense of her experience. And it does bring us through the arc of the relationship in somewhat of a linear experience. So the book does start before the relationship, the middle of the book is during, and then the ending is after the relationship, more or less. So this is another one that's definitely not for everyone, but I really liked it, and I really liked the way that it portrayed kind of that psychological abuse. So 5 out of 5. We're gonna come back tomorrow, Thursday, for our 4th book, which will be Dark Matter. So I will see you again in the morning. In the meantime, I'm going to go work on a crochet project. Okay. Okay, so today is going to be a little bit more stressful just because I'm going to be going to the gym this morning and then we are going out to fancy dinner tonight. So, we're going to go ahead and just get started. I don't have my phone on me. It is currently about 9:30. I don't know why I feel the need to show you guys the time, but it feels like it makes it more authentic. I don't know. Happy Thursday. We're going to read Dark Matter. I wonder if reading this book will make the synopsis stop feeling so much like the 4th Shrek movie, which so far everyone that I've talked to in my life has no recollection of that film, and by has no recollection, they're pretty sure they never saw it. In any case, I'm here for an AU. Let's read. Okay, it is 1:05 a.m. on Friday morning, and book 4 is in the books. The fact that I'm up until 1 a.m. is pretty much the consequences of my own actions, and I'll probably be feeling it tomorrow, but it's fine. So Dark Matter. This was not a bad book, necessarily, but it was not my favorite. It definitely felt kind of convoluted at points. It was very philosophical in its approach. It kind of reminded me of that Taylor Jenkins Reid romance book, Maybe in Another Life, but darker. Definitely grittier, a lot more death, a lot more trying to invoke the imagery of like an action movie, especially towards the end. It really kind of goes down to that fundamental philosophical core of if we are beings with free will, then we are constantly making choices. And for every choice that we make, there is that possibility of another universe in which we made the other choice. So maybe in another life, I recorded a book talk for it. I don't know if that's out yet or not, but if not, be on the lookout for it. It just sort of focuses on one particular choice and how a life can splinter off in two completely different directions based on that. This gets a little bit more nitty-gritty into how there are just infinite options. There are infinite possibilities. There are infinite other universes, which is interesting, but not really what I was looking for. I can't really fault the book for that necessarily, although it was not the vibe that I originally got from the synopsis. I don't know if this is a spoiler to say, but I definitely feel like there should have been like that Spider-Man pointing meme a few points in the book. I'll say overall it was interesting. This was the first one that was properly in first person, although there were 3 chapters that went into third person for reasons that do make sense for the story. There were definitely kind of points that felt repetitive, and there were a few ends that felt like they weren't fully tied up. Like, there's a character that we kind of develop a relationship with kind of in that first third to half of the book. It feels like there's this connection that's not really realized or answered. I feel like there are a few areas that I would really have liked to have seen more detail and especially thought process in. I'll also say a lot of what happened in this book was hard for me to visualize because so many of the concepts were so abstract and theoretical, and they were manifested in somewhat of a physical way, but the descriptions weren't really giving. I think there's a degree to which this book I'm not the target audience for this book. I feel like there would be people who would love this one. So, philosophical, a little bit gritty, a little bit leaning really heavily into physics. I do feel like I need to start a whole segment on pretty much all of my book talks of the title drop, because I feel like some books give you that title drop and they do it so like in your face. Sometimes they do it and it's subtle and you kind of miss it, and sometimes they don't do a title drop, and I feel like this just needs to be a segment of, was there a title drop? In this book there absolutely was, on page 112 of my copy. It's a mystery, but there are clues. Most astrophysicists believe that the force holding stars and galaxies together, the thing that makes our whole universe work, comes from a theoretical substance we can't measure or observe directly, something they call dark matter. And this dark matter makes up most of the known universe. And then Daniela is like, what's it made out of? And even I'm like, we don't know, that's why it's called dark matter, because we have no idea. I'll say there were a few moments in this book that I think were intended to break my heart, and I don't think it did quite what it was seeking to do for me. Because there are 2 separate instances at which we see a character die. And yes, it's sad and all, but also we know that it's real. Like, it's totally real, but it's not real to our main character. Like, it doesn't have any real repercussions for his existence in the world. And like, the first death only makes me concerned for a completely different character who ends up being irrelevant anyway. I'm just gonna say, I give it a 3.5 out of 5 stars. If I have to do like an even like whole number, I would round it down to 3. It wasn't my cup of tea entirely, but it wasn't the worst. I would put it on par with Misery-ish, but it's also a completely different book from Misery. So like, this is not saying if you liked Misery you would like this book, because they are very different. Yeah, I am very tired. I am ready for bed, so I'm going to go to sleep, and I will catch you in a few hours for our final book of the week. Okay. Good morning and happy Friday. It is almost 10 a.m. So we are going to get started with the Cellar in just a moment. Before we start on the last book, I do just kind of want to address some things because I started thinking about some stuff after I went to bed last night. So one of the things I kind of avoided in this particular week was like classic horror, Dracula and Frankenstein. And that's partly because older writing tends to be a little bit harder for me to kind of muddle through, so it's a lot slower, which is not what I want out of a 5 books in 5 days challenge. Secondly, I'm not entirely sure that I even own those books. I might. Part of what I was wanting to do with this challenge was read through some books that I already have. And third, part of the reason why I was doing this challenge was because I have a horror writing class coming up and I just needed to get reacquainted with the genre. Granted, most of what I've been reading has been more thriller than pure horror. I am definitely noticing the severe lack of kind of monster stories. A lot of these are more people doing things to other people. With last night's book, Dark Matter, having kind of that weird sci-fi edition. But I do think it's okay because in any writing class ever, there's also a lot of reading involved. It's not like we're just sitting around in a circle writing to our heart's content. There's a lot of reading and analysis and application from those readings. What can we apply to our own writing? What do we admire? What do we decide like, oh no, this is absolutely awful? And in my discussion of some of these books, you may have noticed that in just the way I discuss it, like in Misery when I talked about how it does a lot of telling when it should be showing at the beginning. That is as much just a note for me to recognize what I liked and what I didn't like about Misery, and if I were to approach a similar story, how would I do it differently? All of that prologue to say, let's finish this challenge up. I will again say I do appreciate the variety that I have in terms of the books I'm reading this week, because like the first one is supposedly the King of Horror, Stephen King. I'm not sold, but we'll accept it. And his was, I think, the oldest book that I read this week. His book was published in the late 80s. In the Dream House was 2019. Tender is the Flesh was... when was that published? Tender is the Flesh was originally published in 2017, but it was translated in 2020. This one's from around 2014. And I'm not sure when Dark Matter came out, but it wasn't that long ago. 2017. And I wanted books that were published mostly recently, specifically to kind of have an understanding of what's working in the market, what kind of style of writing works, but also the kind of stories that are working. Because that's something that like Dracula and Frankenstein wouldn't be able to tell me what is currently trending. Not necessarily to say that I write specifically to trends, but it does give me kind of a sense of what's happening now and what's kind of being played with, who's stealing from who, so on and so forth. Anyways, I feel like I'm just talking and talking and talking and I'm not getting to the book. So we're gonna get to the book now. Oh, let's go. Okay, it is now 1:40. I am 40 pages into this book, mostly because I've been putting off reading it all morning. And the reason for that is not because the book is bad, but it is very boring. There's a lot of exposition happening and a lot of just sort of like memories and things that don't really line up with what's happening. A lot of just sort of explaining things that don't need explained. Some of the dialogue feels just kind of forced. There's a lot of internal dialogue with the character that also kind of feels forced. That's not to say that it's not realistic, but it's not the vibe. But I'm not gonna give up on it. It's slow going as we're going. If I just make myself sit down and just read it, it'll be over sooner. Maybe it gets better, maybe it doesn't. I will say there is a kind of changing point of view, so it does tell you at the beginning of each chapter whose point of view we are in. I'm not a super huge fan of that. I kind of just want to stick with the main character that we started with, because I feel like a lot of the other stuff that's happening in this world, we can make sense of it based on what's happening from her perspective. We've only done the perspective shift once, so maybe that's an inaccurate statement, but I don't know. I'm just not vibing with this one. And it's unfortunate because this one has been like on my list for a long time, and it's kind of disappointing me right now. I will say that at least as of right now, there are other books in the series. I would assume that they follow different characters because it doesn't seem like the kind of story that would follow the same character for 4 books, but I'm not feeling like I'm gonna pick up any of the other books after this one. We'll see. Again, we're only 40 pages in. I'm getting the sense that I want to DNF this, but we're gonna see. It might get better. It could get worse. I'll check back in with you later. 7:45 and we're done! Let's talk about this book. I struggled. So I will say, once I sort of forced myself to sit down and just power through it, it did get better, kind of. Similar to Misery, the first 50 to 100 pages were just sort of meh. Although it does hype up in intensity a lot faster than Misery does, because we do actually see the scene in which Summer, our main character, gets kidnapped. One of the biggest issues that I had in reading this was the voice of Summer. She didn't feel fully realized to a degree. It's like towards the beginning, she kind of had this somewhat sarcastic, but in somewhat of a juvenile way. So on page 7, it's around the time that she is about to be kidnapped. She has had her encounter with the man who is going to kidnap her. He's calling her Lily. She's confused. But rather than panicking or expressing her panic, we get this weird focus on how still his hair is, which we understand later in the story is meant to kind of convey something about his character and how pristine he is as a person. Everything has to always be, in its place. But tonally, asking the question of how much hairspray must he have used just does not fit. It feels comedic in a moment that shouldn't be comedic. On page 42, she's been kidnapped. She's in the cellar, title drop. She has just slept. It is the second day. The other girls are trying to get her prepared for the day. And her description is, "We were like a lame group of friends at school that thought it was cool to have matching days. I felt like we should start braiding each other's hair and talk about dreamy boys." Which, okay, that could be a realistic thought, but also tonally, from a reader's perspective, this feels so out of left field. That image is so snarky, but it comes across from a humorous light. It feels like the kind of line that you would get out of one of those knockoff Mean Girls movies. I understand the need for some humor in these kind of stories to sort of counterbalance the tragedy. Because if everything is tragic all the time and everything sucks and everything's sad, especially in a young adult novel, it starts to kind of lose its impact. But that just was not the moment, and that was not the way. I also struggled a little bit with the flashbacks. They felt less important. They were kind of distracting to me. To me, they didn't really support the plot so much as tried to make us feel something for the character. And the way that everything sort of played out, the flashbacks do not occur naturally within the narrative. They are all given the dates, which sort of pulls you out of the story, and it makes it feel like these are going to be relevant to what is happening in the current day, and it's not. We can understand that Summer and Lewis have a good relationship going for them without all of these flashbacks. And I did appreciate jumping to Lewis's perspective throughout the novel just to kind of see they are searching for her. And I feel like that is enough to tell me that They love each other a lot. Between her perspective and her thinking about him, and his perspective and him thinking about her, and how much he's trying to search for her and through the entire time, and how neither of them are giving up hope in the other. I feel like that's enough. We do not need all of this backstory. It's another one of those things that just sort of breaks up the flow of the story for me, because we go from these like really traumatic moments to all of a sudden, oh, they're so cute together, and it feels weird. The other thing that I struggled with this story is the stakes. I feel like the stakes were really low. That's not to say that we need to just sit here and torture all of the characters, although sometimes absolutely Cinnamon is trying to steal the book. What are you going to do with this? But through the first major chunk of the story, she is really concerned about making sure that she gets out before he violates her, because he is taking his time and trying to develop feelings and make sure that she is a fit for the family and all of this. And once he brings home a new girl, he realizes how attentive she is and decides, okay, it's time. And so once he violates her, it felt very anticlimactic, because up to this point, the whole story was just her trying to keep herself under the radar and try to keep away from him so that he didn't do this thing. Then once it happens, it just sort of quickly happens. And we get a little bit of time with her grieving, which is totally fine. But then that's just it. And it's like never really brought up again. It's like, she basically returns to not really normal, because nothing is really normal in this situation, but like a normal-ish range. But also at that point, the stakes for Summer just sort of drop off into oblivion. Like at that point, nothing new is really happening. She doesn't really have anything new to lose. We don't really see a moment where her life is directly threatened. And even so far as a moment where he is violently aggressive towards her, we don't actually see it, we just see the aftermath. So near the end of the book, she is putting makeup on her face because she has a black eye, and I guess she has a bruise on her arm somewhere. We didn't actually see that moment of violence happen to know why she has the bruises she has, and that feels like a wasted opportunity. As far as the progression of the story is concerned, it's fine. It runs smoothly. There are points where we do get the kidnapper's perspective, and I think it's meant to give us an indication of what's going through his head, how he sort of justifies this whole situation, which is fine. You definitely do get that sense of he is mentally unwell, which we can infer based on the fact that he is kidnapping these girls and he is killing prostitutes. Like, what mentally sane person does that? We don't need his perspective to know that he is cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs, but we do get a little bit of insight as to some of the things that happened in his youth that caused this, specifically having to do with his parents. But there's something to do with his mom that's never really fully realized, and it just leaves me with so many questions. There's just so much that could have happened, that could have been shown, that just wasn't, and I have so many questions. More questions than I think I would have had we never jumped into his perspective. In summary, I was disappointed. I wanted this book to be amazing, partly because I feel like YA just gets the brunt end of the stick all the time, and we need some good YA representation out there, and this was not it for me. As a writer, I feel really bad giving negative reviews and like negative perspectives on books, because I know that authors pour their heart and their souls into writing these stories. And I know that this story in particular would be one that is kind of emotionally traumatic to write about, because it's an emotionally traumatic situation. At this point, I don't think me throwing my opinion into the void is going to influence the reputation of this book, considering it came out in 2014. I give this book like 2 out of 5 stars. It was meh at best. We did it. We are here. We are finished. I am free of my curse. I somehow managed to still have a life this week while doing this. Which just goes to show I probably could fit more time in my life to read more. Will this experiment actually change anything about my normal day-to-day life? Probably not. One can hope, because I have so many books that I need to read. But in the meantime, I am going to go eat some supper because I am starving. I am going to go rest my brain because I'm just mentally exhausted at this point. Like this video if you liked it. Let me know down in the comments below if you've read any of these books, what you thought of them, if you think I should do more reading and writing challenges in the future. If there are any books from this challenge that you would like me to elaborate more on through a proper book talk. I already know Tenors the Flesh I definitely want to talk more about because this was a lot and I'm thinking about it for In the Dream House and Misery. If there are any other reading challenges you would like me to do, if you think I should do 5 books in 5 days again, let me know. And yeah, while you're down there, subscribe to my channel because I post new videos every Wednesday for whatever Wednesday. It's Friday right now, but you'll see this on a Wednesday. Also because Cinnamon is here and Cinnamon's adorable, and wouldn't you want to subscribe just for his cute little face? He wants to get the squeaky toy that I took away from him because I was recording a video. So yes, like, subscribe, comment, and I will see you next Wednesday. Have a great week. Bye! You say bye, Cinnamon? Oh, bye! Oh, bye-bye-bye! Oh, bye-bye-bye! Mwah! Boop. You want your toy? Go get it. I'm just trying to